Well, welcome to another session of our summary of our discussions of the social principles of the United Methodist Church as they were revised here in 2024. Took me an extra day to get to this. Our meeting and discussion yesterday, normally we've met for an hour. Last night or yesterday, our meeting lasted for 2 hours. This was a much longer discussion. We'll see how my summary goes. I may split it in two. But we're going to just get started, and this is going to be, I'm sure, a whirlwind. We started out on page 22 of the document in the social community section on human sexuality and began by summarizing what it says, which is an affirming of human sexuality as a sacred gift and acknowledge that sexual intimacy contributes to the fostering of the emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being of individuals and to nurturing healthy human sexual relationships that are grounded in love, care, and respect. It goes on to talk about the combination of nature and nurture, heredity and genetics in sexuality, diversity of choices in relation to sexuality, such as celibacy, marriage, and singleness. And also, when we really summarized this whole section, it really was about consent. And so the last paragraph makes that very clear. We support the rights of all people to exercise personal consent in sexual relationships, to make decisions about their own bodies and to be supported in those decisions, to receive comprehensive sexual education and to be free from sexual exploitation and violence, and to have access to adequate sexual health care. So as we talked about those things, the first question that I asked was, how does this contrast with how some people stereotype what Christians think of sexuality? And of course, the answers were pretty much what I expected. The idea is that Christians think we should abstain from all sex, that sex is somehow a sin, that it's only for procreation between male and female in marriage. Let's see, what else? That healthcare decisions aren't as important. How do I phrase that? One person was concerned that in society, Christians often come across as perceiving that women's health care is not important. Whether that's true or not, again, these are the stereotypes that people have of Christians and sexuality. So then we began to do the thing that makes everybody blush a little bit, and we started talking about our experience of sexuality. And the first question that I asked was, when has sexuality been a positive thing in your life? And some of the answers that were generated from that were parenthood, young love, the intimacy of marriage, coming out to some people. Some people, the experience of coming out was a positive one. Overall, I think people were kind of smiling as they were thinking about it. We didn't get into details, but you could definitely tell that there was some thinking about sexuality as a positive thing. And then we talked about when sexuality has been a harmful or negative thing in life. One of the gentlemen shared his experience while he was in the Navy in Japan and Korea, and they were at port and getting off the boat and seeing all the fathers bringing their daughters as sex workers, and maybe they weren't even daughters, possibly sex slaves, to the sailors or to those that were getting off the boat. And that clearly impacted him in a pretty strong way, feeling that that was a very negative experience of sexuality. But he also pointed out that it was a reminder to him and something that he learned, that different cultures have very different expressions of sexuality. I don't mean that quite that way. different cultures have different levels of comfort with sexuality. And in the United States, particularly within the church, we don't talk about sex. It's just something we don't talk about. But in other cultures, sex is very much out in front. It is a topic of conversation. And his experience was that in those places, sexuality was much more out in front. Other negative experiences of sexuality, the expectations of others on what your sexuality, when sex is wanted in a relationship or not, sexual violence, and then coming out to certain people was a very negative experience. So human sexuality in our experience, we spend a lot of time talking about this, as you can see, just with all that list of ideas and thoughts. I'm going to move us quickly, though, to marriage, which in some ways follows from that, but in some ways doesn't. The statement on marriage is the one place in the document where what you may have, it depends on the version of the document you have, was revised during General Conference. Everything else in the document passed without any amendments. But this one was revised by an African delegate who wanted to make sure that in addition to broadening the definition of marriage, we were also including the legal definition of marriage in her country. So the first paragraph is what was revised, and it now says, "Within the church, we affirm marriage as a sacred, lifelong covenant that brings two people of faith, an adult man and woman of consenting age, or two adult persons of consenting age, into union with one another." The statement then does go on to say we don't recognize marriage as a sacrament, which was raised a question of what's a sacrament. And a sacrament is, of course, one of those things that we feel that that Christ commands us to do. And so we don't see marriage as something that we are commanded to do, but it is something that we celebrate and cherish as an expression of a couple's love and their relationship with each other and with God. We talk about marriage as a covenantal bond that encompasses intimacy, grace, and love. And then the last paragraph of this statement tries to recognize that marriage in different places is very different. We don't realize how much marriage is defined by our culture, but I was reading a book recently which was talking about marriage, and one of the things that it expressed was how hard it is to define across cultures. For some, it is simply living together. But others, it's a very civil, it's something that the government does. In other places, it can only be done by a religious leader. Some, there's no sense of ceremony at all. It is a contract. Some places, it's just two people coming together, and by being together, they're married. Culture to culture, it defines marriage so differently. Even, we're going to get into some of these later, even in the purpose of marriage. And so the last paragraph attempts to deal with some of that. As members of the larger society, we affirm the importance of civil marriage, the legal recognition of domestic unions by the state. Such legal recognition is vital for guaranteeing family stability and orderly regulation of inheritance, and providing assurances that spouses and children are afforded all the rights, benefits, and protections to which they are entitled. From there, we talked about, obviously, this lifts up some of the reasons people get married, that intimacy, that grace, that love. But we also talked about what are some of the other reasons people get married. Security is one. Companionship, money, taxes, health care. When somebody's pregnant, then suddenly someone feels the need to get married. Sometimes just to get out of the house or an abusive situation. in not so much in the United States do we see it, but there are times and places where marriages are politically arranged. So there are lots of reasons people get married. There are lots of reasons people get married. Then ask the personal question of, in your experience, what are the blessings of marriage? And we talked about pretty much many of the same things, but things like the partnership and companionship, the sharing of ideas. One of the widows expressed that was one of the things that she missed most, was the sharing of ideas. Healthcare decisions. It's really important to have someone else to be able to help make those. Household duties. It's really hard to get everything done, and when you can split duties and have more than one person working on them, it makes things easier. So those are some of them. It's certainly not a comprehensive list. I hope you can come up with some more reasons that marriage is a blessing. We then went to biblical texts that come to mind when we think about marriage, and of course there are many, many. The first one that was mentioned, so I just threw it out there, was the Ephesians 5 passage, which talks about wives submitting to your husbands, but then the reminder that it also talks about husbands loving their wives as Christ loves the church. And there is also a phrase right before the part where people usually begin the passage where it says, submit yourselves one to another. But that is one that comes to mind when people think about marriage. It's certainly one of the texts that gets brought out most. If there's an abuser out there, they generally know that passage. Abusive husbands like to quote that one. It's one of the most misused passages in Scripture. And yet it also has that sense of reminding ourselves that we belong to one another. Genesis 2:24, it's for this reason that a man leaves his family and unites with his wife, and the two become one flesh. An oft-used passage about marriage and how two people become one. Let's see, others that were brought up. Ruth, a good example. So the story of Ruth is a woman that is married. Her mother-in-law is also obviously married. The father-in-law dies. Ruth's husband dies, and so you just have Naomi, who is the mother-in-law, and Ruth left. Ruth decides to go and stay with her mother-in-law when her mother-in-law moves back to her homeland. And this brings in then something in the Bible that many of us probably aren't comfortable with, and quite honestly might even think is yucky and icky, and that is the idea of the levirate marriage. So what the levirate marriage is it is when a man dies and he does not have any children with his wife. The wife is then married to the next of kin, usually a brother, but not always. In Ruth's case, it's a little more distant than that. And then the first child that they have together is considered the child of the deceased husband. And this is to continue on the line. The line of the family was vitally important. They didn't want that family line, that individual, to be without children. They wanted someone to carry on his name. That was really, really important. But to us, the idea that a woman would need to marry her brother-in-law or cousin-in-law, or that a brother-in-law would have to marry his brother's wife, his sister-in-law, essentially, that feels pretty weird to us. But this is a very common practice in the Bible. In fact, it's commanded in Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, if you would like to look at that. Continuing talking about other passages on marriage. We talked about the image of the church as the bride of Christ, which is one I personally hadn't really thought of, but it is an image of marriage. It does come with a bit of problematic thinking because Christ is described as the head of the church, and so this could be misconstrued as saying that in all marriages the husband is the head of the family, which is one of those ideas that sometimes drifts through Christianity, and but it is also a beautiful image of the love that one has for the other, a sacrificial love of Christ for the church. So there is a beauty to it too. And the final one that was brought up was David, because David has some complexity in his marriages, I guess, is why it comes to mind. And we're going to cover David a bit in some others as we go on. But for right now, probably the piece that people are most aware of with David when we think of marriage is that he was married to multiple wives, and we're going to get to the polygamy in a little bit, and that he also, the whole story of Bathsheba and him essentially killing a man for that man's wife, killing Uriah for Bathsheba, definitely impacts how we think about David and whether or not he was a good man. Clearly he's a good man in many things, but not in terms of this particular situation. And so just another biblical text that came to mind when we thought of marriage. Okay, I'm going to do one more section, I think, and then we're going to split off, looking at where we're at time-wise. We're going to look at child marriage. And that's the next section here. So it's section 1 under this heading of marriage. And this one talks about rejecting the marital relationships with children and youth under age 18, even in places where such relationships are culturally or legally permissible. And we actually talked about in Michigan what is the age of consent for marriage, and not just consent, but can parents consent on behalf of the children. We talked about people that we knew who were married under the age of 18. Many of us have grandparents. Some may even have, and you yourselves have been married under the age of 18. But we talked about why that would be an important age to begin to think about marriage and to wait until that time. In the statement, it says, waiting until a more appropriate age to wed offers better opportunities for children and youth to grow into healthy adulthood and become full contributing members of society. We therefore believe young people should be of legal age to give their consent before entering into marriage. We did talk about, of course, thinking of ideas in scriptures. Immediately the question was of Mary. The tradition has been that Mary was perhaps as young as 14. There are Jewish scholars and historians that know that time period well and what was standard practice in that day and age, and it is unlikely, they say, that a Jewish woman would be married that young. More likely it was 16 to 20. So it's been one of our stereotypes that people got married very young in that era, but perhaps not as true as our stereotype has thought. But still, if she was 16, is younger than this age. And what do we do with that? We talked a bit about what the age of consent and when people were considered adults in that era, and it was much younger. The idea in the society then was that when one became about 13, 14, one was an adult and began to make decisions and pursue a career for themselves. So age of consent was much younger. What we do with that, whether we agree with that or not, it's one of those cultural differences. But just to know that, yeah, we would probably have a problem with Mary being 14 getting married, and I think that's rightly so. Not to question our traditional beliefs too much, but at the same time, knowing that if I look at a 14-year-old or even a 16-year-old, it's there's a lot of growth yet to happen before real maturity arrives, and I think waiting until the age of 18 is a wise thing. Okay, we're gonna split this one so that you don't have to listen for too long in any one of these sessions. But thank you for beginning the discussion of sexuality and marriage with us, and I look forward to you continuing to be with us in the part 2.